journalism cast a wider net on the World Cup and the issues in general. Grant?
Did Gianni Infantino, the FIFA president, write that headline you referred to? Um, he sent out a letter basically saying that exact same thing to all 32 national federations competing in the World Cup. And some federations already responded to him, including, I think, England and Wales, saying, no, actually, we're not just going to stick to football. I just feel it's not reflecting reality to say that sports and politics are completely separate. We've seen so many examples in the history of the Olympics, in the history of the World Cup, of politics influencing those events and the people involved in the host countries. And you're sort of sticking your head in the sand if you're resolving not to address that this can be complex and there can be influences moving in both directions. And usually the people, in my experience, who ask us to stick to sports are some of the worst actors out there, whether it's Vladimir Putin hosting the World Cup in 2018 in Russia, or plenty of other examples. So I'm a journalist. I cover what's out there, what's happening. And so you're going to cover more than just the sports.
Thank you. Neha?
I would totally agree with Grant on that. I'm an anthropologist, so nothing is just something, right? Everything has social meaning and is embedded in a network of power relations. So there's nothing that is just sports. We have to kind of think about all of the ways that we consider what's valuable to us as sports, right? So for me, as somebody who's not, and I'm sorry, I hope I don't offend people, I'm not a huge football fan, but I do watch the World Cup, like towards the end when it's kind of down to the last few people. But I've been following this more in terms of my interest in the Arabian Peninsula, a place where I have been doing research for now over 15 years. And I think that it's really important. Like someone like me who's an anthropologist, it takes me a really long time to publish a book, to write an article. A journalist can cut in there and like provide information really quickly. And that's a good and a bad, right? Because in a lot of ways, there's been a lot of irresponsible journalism around the Gulf that's steeped in a lot of stereotypes about Arab and Muslim societies, but at the same time, they're at the front line and can provide the kind of commentary and analysis that I think an academic is not really able to do in terms of how we operate.
Thank you. Let me follow up with a question first for Grant and then a question for Neha. Grant, since you have covered so many World Cups, what strikes you as different or unique in terms of the arguments of, sort of stick to sports, stick to football, rather than sort of a wider, sort of journalism casting a wider net, trying to find connections between journalism and between sports and politics or many other issues? Is anything particularly different this time around?
With this World Cup in Qatar?
Yeah.
It's always interesting to me how sort of public attitudes get formed. When Qatar won the right to host this World Cup in 2010, the country they beat was the United States. And it was a surprise. And I was there and covered it. And I was also aware of the larger coverage of it. And what was interesting to me at the time was the coverage then in 2010 was mostly, Qatar must have bought this. And this must be corrupt. FIFA must be corrupt. And at that time, there wasn't that much discussion, actually, that I can recall in coverage about migrant workers, LGBTQ rights in Qatar, women's rights in Qatar. That has been more recent. And there have been investigations into whether Qatar and Russia, which got the World Cup for 2018 the exact same day, whether there had been outright bribes. And, according to the U.S. Department of Justice investigation, there were for both the Russia World Cup and the Qatar World Cup, as there were for the Salt Lake City Olympics. And that culture has been pretty rife in FIFA and the International Olympic Committee for a long time. I do find it interesting, though, that the discussion on Qatar has shifted from did they buy it to the human rights angle in recent years. And we've seen it covered in different ways. This is the first World Cup to take place in the Middle East, World Cup or Olympics. And I would be curious to know, I've done a lot of reporting over here by now, not nearly as much as Neha has, but I would be curious to know how many Americans know that Qatar is actually a U.S. government ally, or that there's a U.S. military base here. And so there is a lot more to know, but ever since that 2010 decision was made, I think U.S. soccer fans have felt negatively toward Qatar because they beat the U.S. to host that World Cup.
Mm-hmm. Neha, you mentioned that in some of the coverage that you have seen, you found sort of the use of stereotypes or sort of very conventional, what I will say, derogatory narratives on Arabs and Muslims. Can you think of examples of that, how it shows up in some of the coverage that you have seen around the World Cup in Qatar?
So I haven't been following super closely all of the coverage on this World Cup recently. It's getting a little bit crazy in terms of everybody wants to cover it, right? But I think there was just something a few days ago, and Grant would probably know better, like a cartoon in a French magazine or newspaper that the way that they illustrated the Qatari national team was with the the stereotypical terrorist with the beard and everything like that. I mean, there's definitely been overtones of, this goes back to this question of how could Qatar actually be meritocratic or whatever in terms of winning the World Cup, right? There has to be something wrong, something's corrupt, something's bad. And I'm not saying that that's not true, but I think that the kind of terminology, there's references to the emir all the time and sheikhs all the time. There's terminology that presents Qatar as if it's some kind of exceptional place that's different from, and its problems are different from those that happen in other parts of the world. I mean, it's wild to me, quite honestly, that if you think about it, what kind of coverage would there be of the United States if the United States had won the World Cup, right? We have a horrible human rights record that we don't have to account for in the United States. We treat LGBTQ and trans people terribly. Trans women are the most murdered category of people in the United States. I'm afraid now for my uterus, right? So how do we reconcile the way that we would discuss this kind of stuff if it was happening in the United States with the way that we discuss it when it's happening in Qatar? And I think a lot of people have never been to Qatar. They just see the kind of bling bling and all of this kind of stuff without actually thinking of it as a place where people actually live. And in every place that people live, they have to deal with restrictive things that happen in terms of politics. And there's also things that are enabled by being there. And I think, and this is not, I know I get called an apologist a lot. This is not being an apologist. I think that actually you cannot address human rights issues in any place, especially a top-down, small authoritarian country, if you're pissing everybody off. Right. And if you're not actually taking account for all of the actors that are involved in human rights abuses. It's not just the country state that creates the human rights abuses, right? Those human rights abuses are transnational, and they begin much before anybody even migrates to the Gulf. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and you raised a number of very interesting points. Grant, what is your take on some of the issues that Neha just mentioned in terms of the let's say conventional approaches or some of the stories that we have seen about covering human rights issues in Qatar? Is some journalism using double standards, coming Qatar different than it would have been covering some of these issues somewhere else? Are the situations essentially different? And therefore, that's what journalism tends to cover on certain issues in Qatar or in other um, World Cup host?
I mean, the U.S. now is hosting World Cup 26 with Canada and Mexico. And I'm curious to see what sort of response I get when I do a story on human rights and that topic in terms of the 26 co-host. My guess is I'll get some varied responses. Um, I also, though, don't necessarily want to get into a false equivalence thing. I just want to do reporting on each host, as I've done for Qatar, as I did for Russia, as I plan to do for the US in 26. And so there's a wide range of quality when it comes to journalism, especially globally. And so we're already seeing British tabloids incorrectly report that the U.S. is going to be wearing a rainbow badge on their shirts during the games here, just because the U.S. did post and does have a rainbow badge at their training site where the media is and where this got reported heavily yesterday. So like the Daily Mail erroneously reported today that, oh, the U.S. team's wearing this on their shirts, and they're just going to wear what they normally do, but they still wanted to make a statement. And so what I've tried to do, at least in my reporting, is to be on the higher end of the quality scale in terms of, I don't know how many sports journalists globally actually went to Qatar in the months before the tournament and spoke to a bunch of migrant workers. And I came here with an open mind, literally just wanting to hear what they said when I asked them about the new laws in Qatar, which came out in 2019 to protect workers and were a sign of legitimate, genuine progress, including in the region, in terms of worker protections. And so I went to 14 FIFA hotels here, including the U.S. team hotel, which is like the most opulent hotel of the bunch, and spoke to at least one worker in each of them, sometimes more. And there were some trends that came out of that. Certain things were being followed, they told me, like the minimum wage, which is about, I think it works out to about $1.25 an hour, so it's low. But there is a minimum wage. Workers told me, this isn't a giant academic study over years, so I did what I could during the time I was here. Some workers, migrant workers, still didn't have control of their passport, which is illegal. Their employer had it. Several workers told me they could not change jobs if they wanted to inside Qatar, which is under the new laws illegal. Several told me that they paid significant recruitment fees even in recent months to get here, which is supposed to be illegal. So I think it's important to report the whole thing, that it's huge that the new laws were passed. That took a lot of work. A lot of it, probably at least in Qatar, was connected to pressure around the World Cup from around the world, and trade unions and global workers associations. But the enforcement on the ground clearly needs to get better.
Right. Let me get back to you, Neha. I mean, can you speak about what kind of coverage you think it will be closer to your vision of what will make sense without falling into some of the problems that you have identified, that you comment on before?
I mean, I think exactly what Grant's talking about, right? Are you covering a place that you haven't even been to? What are you relying on for the information around that place? Like how legitimate are those sources? I mean, honestly, what good journalists do and what good ethnographers do is not very different. We talk to people, right? I think we just do it with different ethical parameters that we have to abide by. We do it with different time scales, but I always find that journalists are very similar to ethnographers in terms of like, we go places, we interview people, we ask them. I think what I find happens a lot though when I'm talking to people about the Gulf in general, and this is not just about the World Cup, is that this kind of way that like challenging the representations that come out by telling people that why don't you go there, why don't you actually do some kinds of like conversations with people. There's already this preconceived notion that everything anybody says is going to be completely shut down because it's an authoritarian context. And I don't think people really understand that the day-to-day life of living in an authoritarian context is not really much different than living anywhere else. I've spoken to lots of different people at lots of different scales of wealth and lots of different jobs. And yes, everybody's constrained in a certain kind of way, but you know, the hotel worker in any place that I go, not just in Qatar or Dubai, right, is going to be constrained about what they feel they can say and what they feel they can't say. So I really applaud the fact that you've actually gone and talked to folks. And I think that's the kind of coverage that I would like to read. And that's what I would like to know more about, right? That there is, you know, Qatar has responded in certain kinds of ways to these criticisms, and that those criticisms have been there much longer than just, you know, around the World Cup. But there also is this kind of shutting down of even wanting to hear voices, because there's this, like, when we use terminology like modern day slavery, right, you already erase the voices of anybody that you would want to speak to, because you're claiming that they have no rights and they have no choices and they have no agency. So that's the only thing that I have to say here, is just that there's an overuse of certain kinds of metaphors that keeps us from actually thinking about this area, the Gulf, as like an ordinary place where ordinary things happen. Might they happen in different kinds of ways? Yes, but there's everyday people living here from all different strata of society. These are some of the most diverse places in the entire world. It would be interesting if the people who wanted to write about this place actually came to this place and did the research. So I really I think I'm in a lot of agreement with Grant on this.
So, but that's the question of the fact that we're talking about an authoritarian regime is an important dimension of these questions, the kind of coverage, not in terms of the due diligence that journalists should do in terms of talking to locals about the situation, but of the overall conditions for speech or for knowing stories. So, for example, you know, I grew up in Argentina. I live in Argentina. I was in high school when the 1978 World Cup took place. And for many people, sort of, they found out, and many vehemently rejected what the international press was covering about what was going on in the country at that time. So the fact that, yes, the question of whether or not there is the opportunity or not for speech matters at the local level, and the overall conditions in which there are human rights abuses, whether or not the locals have the opportunities, the freedoms, the rights to actually express that, whether or not there are similar violations probably in other countries. Why I'm bringing this up, I think Abraham makes an interesting point here. Whether or not this kind of reporting, I mean, or the reactions after the reporting, he says our reactions don't really end in anything concrete being done. Is that so? If we look at the coverage in the lead up to the World Cup, like the issues that Grant mentioned earlier, are you pessimistic or optimistic where you are in that range about the impact in terms of public reaction or journalism sort of coverage of putting the spotlight on some of these issues? Grant or Neha?
I can start. I mean, it's already clear that the laws that the Qatari government passed that were put into place in 2019, I guess the announcement was first in 2017, that's significant legislative change. And just about everyone I've talked to thinks that the World Cup coming here had an impact on that and made that happen faster. And certainly the International Labor Organization, ITUC, put a lot of public pressure on on the Qatari regime to do that. And I do think there is concern, especially from human rights groups I talk to, about what happens after the World Cup is over. And it's hard for me. I don't want to be naive, but it's hard for me to imagine that they would like go back entirely on what's changed, that would be just terrible PR, to be honest, and policy for the Qatari government. I am curious to see what does happen after the World Cup is over in a number of areas, including whether Qatar scales back its investment in global sports, like owning the soccer team in Paris and spending tremendous amounts of money on it.
Right.
But that's a little bit different than, obviously treatment of workers in your country.
Right. I would like to go back to that issue in a few minutes. The question, the day after, what happens after December 18, right? But let me go back to Neha on the question that I raised earlier. Neha? Doesn't make any difference. I mean, this is the sense that nothing changes warranted, or there are important changes that should be.
I mean, there have been a lot of changes in the labor law, and this is what I'm saying is like, if we're just going to say nothing actually matters, it's all just show, and I can't go there and I can't talk to anybody because it's such a repressive society, then how are we even going to get anywhere? We're just reconfirming already existing biases, right? There have been a lot of changes legally. So just a little bit about the way that migration sponsorship works in the Gulf. It's very similar if you're in the United States to what our H-1B visas and our H-4 visas are about, which is that the employer sponsors the person for the visa, and they're dependent on that employment in order to stay in the country. So what has been going on in the Gulf states for a long time is a sponsorship system that's very decentralized. And that makes it really hard for there to be any government oversight. And that's been convenient, right, for everybody involved, including these very large multinational corporations. And they are multinational corporations who have the kind of power to influence also these small states in terms of what they want and what they don't want in terms of lax labor laws, right? So what we see happening in terms of any of the labor reforms that are happening around the Gulf is this kind of move towards a more centralized oversight. Is that going to be effective? Is it not going to be effective? I think it's piecemeal. Like you have to actually go from like worker site to worker site and talk to people and see what's actually going on the ground. Can I tell you that passports are being held less since I started my fieldwork in 2006 to now? Absolutely, right? And that's coming from somebody who doesn't even research migrant workers directly. I mean, like, construction workers and the kinds of folks that we're talking about in these human rights discourses. So I don't think it's fair to say, oh, it's all just show. Of course, an international community is going to influence any country, but especially a small country that it seems like, oh, Qatar has all this money, so it can do whatever it wants, but that's actually not true, right? It's embedded in these geopolitical relationships, and those geopolitical relationships are very much shaped by American imperial relations, interests in the Gulf. So I do think there have been changes. I think there were changes that were starting even before the World Cup was awarded. Do I think that they're good enough? Probably not. But do I think that they are going to just like they're all for show? I also don't think that that's true. There's a lot of ways in which, especially after Qatar was under siege by the UAE and Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of ways that the Qatari government has drawn in immigrant populations as part of the nation, and I see that actually continuing.
Right. Grant, any thoughts on that? On what Neha just said?
It's interesting when you're here just talking to people, and I just got here my most recent trip yesterday, so keep that in mind. But like, I was just talking with the guy, driving my Uber today about prices, and he said prices have gone up going back to the blockade that she was referring to with the Saudis and UAE. and they've also gone up again for the World Cup on just groceries and all sorts of things. I said, yeah, we got inflation too. But yeah, I mean, that all that she's saying makes sense to me. And, you know, I do think that people I've talked to here, they do care about what the world thinks of them, and I'm already starting to have some conversations like that, but it's just getting going here. And I also remind people, I call a country that's hosting a World Cup during the World Cup like World Cupsville, and this isn't an entirely accurate representation of what a country is like on a day-to-day basis. They're holding a giant international event. They want to be seen as welcoming to people who come here. And so it can be a little different. Like I've been to, Russia during the 2018 World Cup where they were very welcoming then. I've been to Angola during the 2010 Africa Cup of Nations, and that was certainly an authoritarian regime. But even authoritarian regimes hosting giant sports events, they want to try and put their best foot forward, but you also have to realize that you're not necessarily seeing what that country is like on a day-to-day basis outside of that event.
So how journalism avoids that sort of sports washing or putting let's say a decent or human face in a reality that is far from that? How journalism escapes sort of the falling into that trap? Grant?
It's interesting. I look at.
Let me give you an idea. Does it help, for example, that the players and teams have been vocal about protesting the situation, the selection of Qatar, in terms of the work that you do when it's like sort of, I will not say a movement, but there are sort of important voices in global football that actually have been saying a number of things about human rights and other issues, particularly in the lead up in the last weeks.
Yeah, I mean, you saw the Australian national team released a video of all the players and asked for the decriminalization of same-sex relationships and a migrant worker center to be established. You've seen about 10 federations, including the U.S., join Amnesty International and some other human rights organizations asking FIFA to devote as much money as they give in prize money for the Men's World Cup, so like $440 million to migrant workers' families who've lost family members here. We'll see if FIFA does that.
Compensation fund, right?
Yeah, FIFA hasn't made a full decision on whether they're going to do that yet. And even the U.S. soccer response has been striking in that they've endorsed that, but they haven't put out their own press release. It's sort of like they're half endorsing it. They don't want to like offend FIFA too much or something. Right. So there's that stuff comes up, and we've seen other prominent athletes say something. And I'm curious to see if during this tournament we will see any protests from athletes. From the Denmark team has a jersey that has it's all red or all black. Right. That is, they said, is in their apparel company said is they don't want to show themselves, single themselves out during this World Cup. It's a protest. So the amount of those types of protests, I don't know how much we'll actually see though.
Thank you. Neha, let me get back to you. Recently, the Qatari Foreign Minister bin Abdel Rahman was quoted saying he could not understand why there is one standard for football and another for fuel. Quote, this is not the kind of relationship we want to see between two countries like Germany and Qatar in the aftermath of many German players being vocal about human rights record in Qatar. What are your thoughts on that, on the question about double standards, hypocrisy, will not say not just in the way that things are covered, but in the public expressions of very well-known soccer players and other sort of personalities around these issues.
I mean, he's not wrong, right? Um, I think that if you look at the history of the Gulf states in the monarchical form that they are now, that those kinds of monarchies have been supported and even propped up first by the British and their oil interests, and then the U.S. and their oil interests. And there's plenty of scholars that have written about how much easier it is for places in the West to be able to control top-down authoritarian governments in the Middle East in order to get access to those oil resources. And countries in the West actively repress democratic movements that are happening in Middle Eastern countries. So it's in their interests, right?
Mm-hmm.
To have one person or a group of people that you can directly influence so that you can get access to those kinds of resources. So if we're gonna talk about, Qatar as if it's something, as if it's a unitary thing that can like make any kind of compensations and changes, then we do need to talk about the history. And then that shows us how complicit so many other actors are that go well beyond the Qatari state. Like even this compensation fund that you mentioned, which I've not been following this kind of stuff that closely, but like, how would you even, like when you were mentioning it, I'm thinking like, how would that logistically even work? Right? If we have a decentralized immigration system where the Qatari government doesn't really have and has purposefully not had oversight over what's happening, and then you have all of these multinational companies that are purposefully subcontracting and then double subcontracting so that they can remove responsibility for migrant worker lives as much as possible from themselves and place that responsibility onto the worker themselves and say, oh, it was the worker's fault because they're unskilled or they didn't manage things well enough. How are we supposed to then actually compensate anybody? We need to actually hold people accountable beyond this kind of rhetoric of the state. And I think that rhetoric of the state and all these kinds of, proclamations that are coming out say more about the way the country that's making the proclamation wants to look than it says really about what's actually happening on the ground.
Grant, going back to you, the specialist of covering the cup. So what's going to happen with this in terms of holding accountable going forward after December 18 on all these issues that have been discussed, promises, etc. Looking back at your experience actually covering World Cups in the past and the promises made by different governments, and I'm not saying it's the same, but I mean, there is some sort of what will need to happen that we learn from the previous World Cups to actually move forward on these issues.
If I'm being honest, I haven't been back to South Africa since I covered the World Cup there in 2010. I did actually live there for a year not too long before that, but I haven't been back. So, as a journalist, any journalist can go back a few years later and see what the legacy is. And I hope that happens with Qatar, to find out what happened to the stadiums here, what happened, where's the sport, what is the situation with migrant workers? Have the new laws been rolled back or are being enforced any less? Will journalism actually do that? We tend to move on to the next thing.
Right.
And so I don't necessarily expect many journalists to come back to Qatar, but I do know that human rights groups like Amnesty are going to still be here and don't plan on going anywhere.
Right. I remember reading one story about what happened to the stadium after the South Africa Cup 2010 and the state of abandon, et cetera. I mean, 2 or 3 years later. So, I mean, that was sort of focused on one of the story was not. But I understand what you just said in terms of journalism typically moves on to the next story. So the moment is now to raise these issues, to cover these issues later on, unfortunately, for reasons that I think many of us understand why journalism is not likely to go back to the story and do a follow-up story on the many stories that have been done, particularly in the last weeks. Neha, what is your take on this?
So I think that's where, academics actually have that long form sort of investigation where, I mean, if you look at any large scale sporting event, and the kind of scholarship that's come out around it. You know, people are displaced for the building of all of these stadiums, the kinds of economies that come up around there, the amount of sexual violence that happens in those economies. We see the same kinds of things at army bases too, right? I didn't see much of that coverage when we were talking about Brazil, but I see a lot of it when we're talking about Qatar, right? And in fact, there's not that same. It's a very like the dynamics are very different. But I do think it's really important to see what happens afterwards. And I think, but I don't think it's the responsibility of the sports journalists necessarily. Like that, they're sports journalists, right? That's how they frame their parameters of their interest. What I think is actually interesting personally is I'm wondering where all these people were who are so obsessed with Qatar's human rights record during COVID. I mean, there were terrible things happening to like working class immigrants in all across the Gulf and all across the world, frankly, right? And I didn't see those folks covering that stuff. So I think that I just wonder how much this human rights thing is a false flag and how much of it is actually something that is the concern of the people that are writing about it. And this is not just journalists. I'm like talking about the human rights discourses in general that come out around something like Qatar's
So
World Cup.
false flag in what sense was it here?
Like, I mean, there's so much interest in Qatar, right? So much. I can't even tell. I don't even work on these populations of people, and I can't even tell you how many interview requests that like I've had, right? And every person that I know has had in the last couple of weeks. It's just this obsession. I didn't see that obsession around Russia. I mean, I was writing about Qatar and the World Cup in 2018. Where was the conversation about LGBTQ rights and women's rights in Russia? I mean, if it was there, it was very sparse. It wasn't like this absolute, like, you know, obsession. And to me, that obsession is steeped in a particular way of looking at the Middle East, and especially at looking at these Arabian monarchies, that they are, you know, that their wealth is somehow ill-acquired, that if it's a Muslim and Arab nation, that women are going to be treated badly. I think that those kinds of stereotypes, whether they're overt or not, are what is fueling some of this obsession with coverage of Qatar.
Before I go to Professor Peter Loach, I would like to give Grant an opportunity to sort of going back to Russia, for example, 2018. Was that sort of similar attention or not? I mean, we don't have the hard data. I'm probably eventually someone researchers will try to look at the actual data on news stories on these issues across different cups. But what is your recollection, what the coverage was about in the previous cup?
Well, certainly the Russian regime had gotten coverage for interfering in the U.S. elections in 2016, for annexing Crimea in 2014, for state-sponsored doping around the Olympics. That film Icarus is incredible, by the way. I don't know if it's still on Netflix. But it was interesting because I worked for Fox Sports Television during the 2018 World Cup and was sort of horrified, frankly. I don't work for them anymore, but their approach to 2018, they're the rights holder in English in the US, their approach in 2018 with Russia is the same as it is with Qatar. They've even said this: we're not going to cover non-soccer things. We're not going to even address migrant workers, women's rights, LGBTQ. So that was the same for Russia as it is for Qatar. Now, keep in mind, Fox is getting millions and millions of dollars in sponsorship money from Qatar Airways for their broadcasts, and I think that does influence a lot of this. But they're putting their head in the sand in a way that NBC, the rights holder for the Olympics, did not do with China and the Uyghur population there for the Olympics, the Winter Olympics earlier this year. So Fox is making a decision here. But what I did before the 2018 World Cup, I realized Fox was going to do this. And so I thankfully had another job with Sports Illustrated in addition to my Fox job. And I got Gary Kasparov, the former world chess champion from Russia, who's a critic of Putin, to come on my podcast and talk about these issues. And these are choices that journalistic outlets make. These are choices that Fox Sports is making. And so I think it's the wrong choice. If you're gonna broadcast a giant event, I think you should cover the giant sweeping story and all of it and address it. But that's partly why I don't work at Fox anymore.
Thank you, Grant. Peter?
Fascinating conversation. With an eye to the clock, any closing thoughts? I want to give the closing thoughts in reverse order to Grant, to Neha, and then to Silvio. What do you think? What do you think after 40 minutes of this? Grant, what do you think?
I've enjoyed this and appreciate everyone being here. And I do think it's important to think about how journalists cover this Qatar World Cup and compare it to how we cover other events in other countries and different places in the world. And, I'm still learning stuff all the time and trying to do an imperfect, inexact thing as well as I can. But I do know that discussions like this are going to have an influence on how I approach covering things ahead of the World Cup in the U.S. in 26.
Neha, what's your takeaway? Sounds like good news. You've influenced Grant at least.
I mean, I don't think I needed to influence him. Like, I think I'm appreciative of people who are there on the front lines, speaking to people, bringing the kind of information that I think is necessary. And the fact I absolutely agree that sports is not, you can't just put it in a box, right? And say, we're not going to discuss all of these other issues. It's in Fox News' interest in a particular kind of way, right? It's also, has to do with allyship between certain United States interests and certain Gulf interests. I would guess, but I think that I just really hope that the exact kind of scrutiny that is happening right now happens to the United States. I look forward to that. I'll just leave it at that.
So Silvio, that's a bit of an optimistic challenge, I guess, from Neha. Some interesting insights from Grant. You are the incoming president of an international scholarly association on communications. You said you were a teenager in 1978 when your home country hosted the World Cup. What's your big takeaway?
Well, I think that, I agree with this idea that separating sports and politics is fiction for a number of reasons, but primarily because the host countries don't see it that way. That's why they're interested in hosting these major events, because for them it's politics, it's not just sports. So to pretend that sports and politics go in separate tracks, it's actually playing in the hands of those who believe that actually it is true. What it's actually, this is, whether it's Argentina 78 or Russia 2018 or Qatar right now, a massive PR event. So showing the connections between that, I think, to the public is very important. Unfortunately, the problem is, as we have seen in the past, what happens when the news peg, when the games, when the cup, when the final is actually gone, and how journalism and other associations and the public it's not just about journalism or NGOs or governments, it's just the public in general, not sort of veering attention away from these issues that supposedly catch or, sort of attract some kind of attention right now. That to me is always the challenge, sort of what happens the day after.
Indeed, an interesting set of challenges. Thank you, Grant. Follow Grant on Twitter, read his Substack. Pay for Quality Journalism. He's a terrific journalist. I subscribe, you should too. Neha, thank you so much for all of your work. I know I shared your links to your writing on this, and also just the region in general. Let's keep, as you said, the attention on the region. And Silvio, thank you so much for being willing to be the interlocutor here. Thank all of you for tuning in to what I thought was a fascinating conversation. Like several billion of my closest friends, I'm going to be tuning in to the tournament, hoping for the best for human rights, for rights in general around the world, some positive attention. Also hoping that Gio Reyna's hamstring holds out and that Pulisic shows us all of what he can be, and that Weston McKennie, who for my money is the best American player at the moment, is healthy enough to play the games. So with that plug, thank you, Grant. Thank you, Neha. Thank you, Silvio. Thank all of you. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.